Hi everyone, I'm Associate Professor Stephanie Russo and I'm the Discipline Chair of Literature here at Macquarie University, and I'm here today with my colleague Dr. Jeffrey Payne, who is a lecturer here in English. And today we're going to talk about the English major and why you should do an English major and what you can get out of studying an English major. So Jeff, if you were advising a student, what would you say some of the advantages of an English major are?
Well, one of the things that I always tell students when they ask me why study literature is I point out that literature is one of those areas of study that, although many people dismiss it as being made up, as being nothing to do with the real world, actually has a fundamental place in understanding our world today. The stories that we tell about the world create the world that we experience. They help us to understand how we fit into the world. They make the world around us because they create the categories, the kinds of narratives that help us to make sense of the massive ideas that surround us. And so at that very fundamental nature, although we are dealing with things that are made up, that aren't real, the truth that underpins those ideas, the narratives, the way in which those narrative ideas structure the way that we think about the world, is crucial in helping us to understand what we can do in the world to make it the place that we want to live. Does that make sense?
That makes sense to me, and I like the way that you stress that narratives and the way that narratives shape the world is really at the heart of what we do. Because if you think about every human culture across history, the only thing they have in common really is stories.
Right. We are storytelling animals, and the fact that we can tell stories about the world in order to make sense of the phenomena that surround us is a crucial element in all cultural activity. And it becomes, it's something that has application which is as wide as you can consider. The way in which we understand our connection to the country that we live in, the nation that we live in, the people who surround us, all of those things develop by an understanding of the story that we tell about how people are connected to those ideas, right? And so being able to think carefully, scientifically, rationally about the structures of storytelling, about the modes of storytelling, about the ways in which story operate and affect us, becomes crucial in understanding how our culture works, how we work within culture, and how human life connects to the planet and the world around us.
Yeah, and I think what you're really talking about there is communication. And I think for me that what the major thing that students get out of as their studies in English is communication skills, you know, the ability to communicate ideas as well as to understand how others communicate. And that can be in a written sense, oral communication. I think that studying English really equips you with a wide range of skills that allow you to move through the world and understand other people's perspectives and other people's point of views, as well as to express your own ideas and arguments, I guess.
Yeah, and that engagement with other people's perspectives as a fundamental aspect of the way in which we can develop our understanding of ourselves in the world is crucially important. But then also, and you know, I'm glad you mentioned that, stressing on the idea of being able to then create our own, communicate our own understanding of the world to other people in ways that have clarity, in ways that make sense, in ways that are also, let's face it, elegant. Yes. Pretty, beautiful, because although those things sometimes are dismissed as being decorative features, we all know that we're far more likely to be persuaded by something that has that air of panache about it, as opposed to something which is dry or purely instructive or informative.
Yeah, I think we've all had the experience of reading something that has been well crafted and just enjoying the beauty of words, and not only the beauty of words, but just how effective, well-written communication can be. You know, it's always much more pleasant to read something that is well-crafted and well thought through and elegant and thoughtfully structured. And I think that that's a skill that English students can take into any field. You know, sometimes parents, and particularly parents, say to me, you know, why should my son or daughter do English at university? There's not a kind of obvious vocational path for them. But really every field requires you to be good at communicating, whether that's written communication, oral communication. And I think that that's something that English students can do, and that really sets them in good stead for all of their studies and their career, etc.
And of course, that's one of the reasons why in all of our first year units in particular, we have a very strong focal attention on communication skills, how to write effectively, how to conduct analysis, and then not only how to conduct analysis, but how to communicate that analysis effectively in a way that is going to work for other people. So that's, you know, one of the cornerstones of our first year units that we run in the discipline, and then also something that carries through the whole program, that attention to communication skills, written skills.
I think that raises an important point for me, which is that English is something that students have done at school. They have done English throughout their high school experience. And you've really stressed the importance of being able to communicate their own ideas and arguments. So I'd like to turn now to considering how English at high school might be different to how English is taught at university level.
And so one of the ways in which so one of the key things that I think is really different from the way that English is handled at high school to how we handle it at university is that, certainly in my experience in high school education, the study of English has involved preparing texts according to very strictly laid out paradigms or models, and teaching students how to read the text according to that particular paradigm or model, and is therefore very limiting in what you can do with the text. Now, we remain interested in thinking in structured ways about texts, but we also want to stress creative engagement, using structured ways of thinking in order to explain your own response to any particular text. And in fact, we are therefore far more interested in exploring individual responses to texts rather than looking for how students are able to repeat arguments that other people have said. We're looking for what the student brings in, what is new. That's the thing that excites me. When I read an essay from a student and they are explaining in a clear way some idea that I didn't see in there, that is when I think, wow, I've done my job really well. What about for you?
Yeah, that's amazing. I love those moments where you're like, I didn't actually think of it in that way, but that makes complete sense. And that's because everybody's unique and individual, and they bring their own unique and individual ideas to texts. For me, very similar to you, that idea that at university we're interested in arguments, we're not interested in answers, I guess, is the most important thing for me. I always have this experience when teaching first year where a student will come up to me and say, but when do we get the answers? And I'll have to say to them, but there are no answers, there are only your answers, and your answers can be persuasively argued or not, but there are no set answers. I'm not looking for a specific response to text. And I think for some students that can be intimidating at first, the idea that we're not writing to some kind of platonic ideal of an essay in our heads, but we are certainly interested in exploring people's ideas and responses to texts. And I think that, although there is a kind of learning process where people don't quite trust themselves to come up with their own readings of texts, when you do start to get used to that, to the fact that we don't have those set paradigms for reading text that perhaps people were used to in high school, that can be incredibly freeing and incredibly exciting for students. I was just having a conversation with a student just earlier today about all the different ways in which you could read one text, and she was saying that she didn't realise that there were it was all about applying different lenses to text, and that can draw different things out of text. And I think that's a lovely sort of metaphor for the way we read, because we're not interested in finding, how does this text relate to the theme journeys, for example, just to use one off the top of my head. But we're interested in people's different responses and how they can construct an argument and provide evidence for why their response is compelling or interesting.
Yeah, I think it speaks to, there's that axiom that people often bring out that there are no wrong answers in English. And of course, that's misleading. There are wrong answers. You can't
just make stuff up.
You
from
can't
nowhere.
make stuff up. You can't just say a text is about anything. But, and here's, I think, gets to the heart of what you're saying, the crucial thing is to be able to explain why it is what you say it is. And so focusing on how do I build my experience of the text into an argument that makes sense, and how can I communicate my reading of the text? How can I explain my experience to somebody else in a way that is influential, in a way that makes sense to them? And so those are the skills that we look to develop. We don't want to see students just saying this text is about, Wordsworth's poem is about nature because they've been taught to say Wordsworth's poem is about nature. Rather, we want them to be looking at the text and saying, when I read this text, this element speaks to me and sticks out as important. And because it is important in the text, because I can see it, then finding ways to explain why that centrality sticks out of the text, why it is that Wordsworth's construction of nature is actually something that is important today in the world. I mean, Wordsworth's writing 200 years ago. Why should we care? It's because the way in which Wordsworth thinks about the world informs the way that people think about the world today, perhaps in a good way, perhaps in a bad way. And so then to be able to analyse, to be able to think through the implications of the ways in which these ideas are represented.
I think that's really interesting. And I think that, again, to take this back to sort of transferable skills, that ability to build a really persuasive argument and to deploy evidence is something that can be taken into a whole range of fields and areas, because that's really what any piece of writing or good writing is designed to do, is designed to influence and to persuade the reader. And so these are the skills that we're building. So you might think Wordsworth 200 years ago, but the core skills are really very current, very transferable, and very necessary, I think, in today's media landscape. I mean, we're surrounded by text all the time. I mean, even if you think about social media, that's text, So I think that these are very alive and vital skills. I thought we'd turn now to thinking about what you actually do in English. So, Jeff, you are currently convening both of our first year units, our introductory units, which span medieval literature all the way up to 21st century literature across 2 units. What are some of the things you do in first year English?
Okay. So look, I suppose the first year units that we run have 2 primary objectives. The first objective that we have is to give students a grounding in literary history, to help students to understand what happens in literature in English from the earliest points of the history of writing in English through until now, as near to now as what we can get anyway. So we begin in the 13th century and 14th century with some medieval texts, and we work to build up a sense of the patterns of literature, about the different movements in literature across that period of time, and to set in place an idea of how all the stuff that students have engaged with at school or in other places in their reading relate to each other, because that sense of connection between literature is the influences of literature, is one of the core fundamental skills that we need as scholars of literature to understand how things relate. But the other thing that we focus on is aspects of how literature works. So beginning to think about narratological phenomena, so thinking about the ways in which texts are put together in terms of the way they construct meaning, but also thinking about the politics of literature, thinking therefore about the way in which ideas are represented in texts and how those textual representations have power or relate to power in the wider culture. So it's about thinking about the way in which literature evolves over time, and so therefore looking at lots of different text types. Yeah. We canvass traditional modes of literature, poems and plays in the early period, through to the innovation of the novel, which of course we don't think of as an innovation these days, but of course it comes in the 18th century. But then right through until the present day, where we're thinking about new media, we're thinking about film and television, we're thinking about the relationship between fiction and non-fiction, so different categories of literature, different modes, to understand how literature changes its shape but does the kinds of work that it does remain the same, looking for connections and differences, but then also therefore thinking about the processes of how people engage with the world through literature, the function of what we call the aesthetic.
I think that what's so lovely about those two units too is that the texts, I think, are quite surprising. And I think they challenge and surprise our students in various ways, because I think sometimes students can be intimidated by older texts, say medieval or Shakespeare. And in the units, it's really apparent how fresh these texts are, even though they might have been written 700 years ago. They are funny, they're bawdy, they are surprising, they're very, I think, illuminating to students how relevant older texts can be, and how well they speak to some of the newer material across the two units. You really do see connections drawn across many hundreds of years of literary history. And I think that when students finish those two units, they're not only equipped with a knowledge of how literary history works as a kind of story, but they're also able to draw connections across that great span of, 800 years or 700 years or however long we cover in the unit.
Yeah, and of course one of the things that the units do as well is they introduce students into the core ideas that underpin the English major program, which of course are, in the first case, an understanding of what it is to be human.
Yes.
Right? How is it that by understanding narrative, we can gain perspective on how we think about the human animal and who we are and identity within the range of contexts that are available to us. And then, on the other hand, thinking about modality, thinking about the function of the way in which literature works at different periods of time, or using different genres or modes of expression. And so I think that the first year units do a really good job of helping people to prepare students to engage with those ideas, which are so central to, again, a study in the humanities and in the arts, and of course has a wide application across a range of disciplines, not just in literary studies. And so literary studies quite often makes a good pairing with other disciplinary studies as well.
I think that's absolutely right, and you're right that this is not just information that is interesting, but it's also information and ways of learning and thinking that is vital, I think, to be a lifelong learner and to be a global citizen. Thank you, Jeff. That was fantastic to talk to you about the English major, and thank you for joining me here today.
Pleasure. Thank you, Steph.